To me, Warframe is a bit of an easy game. Now, granted, I've played for around 8 years, and with all of that time comes a ton of weapons, warframes, mods, and more for me to use to steamroll basically everything the game has to offer. DE knows this though, and so over the years they've added some much more niche and much more difficult content to the game to really test players' loadouts and capabilities. Of course, I'm talking about the 4 super bosses of the game. There are a small handful of bosses that DE deemed special, and decided that through a few, sometimes convoluted puzzles, should get roided the hell out with new attacks, updates to old ones, and a whole lot of damage resistance to turn some pretty typical assassinations into a full-on nightmare. In addition to all of this, self-reviving is almost completely disabled, meaning aside from a few exceptions, even just one mistake can mean a complete reset. Finally, these fights also put a timer on your life, and if you take too long for any part of it, the game will apply a stacking damage over time effect to you that you physically cannot cleanse, forcing you to end the fight one way or another. No challenge would be fit without ample reward though, so DE gave each boss a silly little accessory for your landing craft, as well as a handful of glyphs and honorita for the truly unemployed, me, to collect for beating the bosses solo with certain warframes. I like getting unique stuff, so today I decided I was going to knock out every super boss so I can make my ship look goofy as and so I can flex on people during loading screens with whatever this is. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. We're getting close to 1,000 subscribers, and it's a great way to support me in the channel. With that out of the way, it's time to beat every single super boss in Warframe. For my first boss, I decided to fight Yanis Captain Vor, as I heard he was the easiest of the bunch. He also holds the glyph for my favorite frame in the game, Atlas, so it was a given that I would pick Vor first. For each frame that I used, I threw together some new builds with survivability in mind, and Atlas was no exception. Because of his innately high health and armor, I landed on a mildly scuffed health tanking build, making use of adaptation and lightning rod of all mods to be better suited to tank Vor's electric attacks. I also ran Arcane Grace and Guardian for the chance at gaining a ton of armor and healing each time I was hit. I also ran a bog standard Gariga build, but this time with the mod Sacrifice equipped. Sacrifice allows your sentinel to kill themselves to revive you, extending the recovery time with each death. While inconsistent, it's still a pretty worthwhile addition to the build, and I'm sure it'll come in handy later. With all of that in mind, I started my first run at Tolstoj. To fight Yanis 4, you have to run around the map looking for auric and glyphs on the walls that are only visible while in operator mode. From there, you have to enter those into a poorly concealed terminal outside of the arena, enabling the fight. It sure would be a shame if these were actually the same every single time, and it would be a double shame if you could conveniently find the code order listed online, letting you circumvent the entire puzzle behind this boss. One wiki search later, and I was in the fight. I was pretty scared going into this fight, so I wanted to try and keep my distance and just spray him down with my burst in. This did not work. Unsure what to do then, I took a peek at his attacks on the wiki when I saw his first phase had an attack that Atlas could very conveniently exploit. If you sit close enough to Vor, he will stop what he's doing to try and punch you, and since Atlas is literally the punching warframe, I made a few minor adjustments to the build and went back to the fight and just started mashing 1. With a bit more energy through Flow and Arcane Energize instead of Arcane Guardian, I can pretty well punch through the entirety of his first phase. During his minion phase, I can restock on health and energy, letting me once again beat the ever-loving hell out of Vor until he decides he's had enough and leaves to go to the second arena. Before we continue the fight, we are forced to go through this evil-ass hallway. Under normal circumstances, these lasers just stagger you and do a bit of damage, but here getting hit teleports you all the way back to the beginning of the hallway. With a little bit of focus, it isn't too bad, but I can totally see someone getting stuck here and running down the timer of the fight. After these lasers though, Vor completely changes his strategy, opting to put away his old moves in favor of a giant-ass laser beam and these tracking orbs that will kill you insanely quickly if you don't destroy them. From this point on, it isn't super viable to continue punching Vor all the time. I haven't mentioned this yet, but Yanis Vor, alongside the rest of the super bosses, has a unique magnetic effect applied to most of his attacks, which not only strips your shields and energy, but also completely disables your abilities for 3 seconds. During the previous phases, this was a lot easier to manage, but at this point in the fight, it just wasn't worth it anymore. I instead opted to kite around the stage with my Latum, dealing as much damage as I could. With one final phase shift, Vor spawns these big-ass cannons before continuing the fight as normal once they're destroyed. At this point, a lucky energy drop gave me a window to get some punches in, but while trying to get away and dodge an attack, I unfortunately went down right as the fight was near its end. I was so close, but with Diriga only recovering while I was in bleed out, I wasn't able to use Sacrifice to save me, and I was just seconds away from having to do it all over again. All of that time and effort put into this run, wasted. Nah, I'm just playing. Vor died with just a second left in bleed out, and once the boss dies, you're actually allowed to self-res again. With that, after just about an hour of attempts, the first of the 4 super bosses was down, and with the glyph and some Dali in hand, I wrapped up the mission with no further issues. Yanis Vor was honestly a really fun fight. He could be a bit of a pain to deal with at range, but once I learned to play closer to him in the early phases, the fight took me no time at all. With him down though, it was time to retire my beautiful punching king in favor of our next frame, Gauss. Gauss at his core is much squishier than Atlas, so rather than health tanking, I chose to go with shield gating. Basically, when your shield runs out, you get a brief period of invulnerability before you can take damage again, scaling with the amount of shields you have. However, rather than stacking a ton of shields for a longer gate duration, you can instead equip catalyzing shields, which massively lowers your shield capacity but forces your gate duration to 1.3 seconds. With other mods to increase your recharge speed and decrease recharge delay, as well as rolling guard to cover your brief periods of vulnerability, you can become nearly unkillable. Going to a Fervo on Deimos, we play the mission as normal up until the point we are able to summon the Fragmented Tide. Simply use the oracles as usual, but once we've collected 30 eyes, we need to collect 30 more eyes. Upon hitting a total of 60, Fibonacci will freak the hell out, indicating that there are no more eyes to grab and we can head to the arena. Summoning the Tide is the same as the usual fight, although things can get very bad very quickly once the one spawns. This thing hits incredibly hard, and although it moves slowly and has really clear telegraphs, I didn't know what to look for on my first run and died in about 30 seconds. The mission time just to reach the one is much longer than it was for Yanis 4, so despite only being one attempt in, that one attempt took me almost 20 minutes. I got a little bit faster as time went though, and after only one more failed attempt, I was ready to fight the boss for real. Gauss is an exceptional frame for this fight, thanks in part to his passive, the battery gauge. When Gauss moves and uses some of his abilities, he gains charge. The higher his battery, the faster his shields recharge and the lower the recharge delay, meaning he is notably more durable with my shield getting build than most other frames I could use it with. Assuming my energy and abilities aren't nullified, I can also use kinetic plating to prevent knockdowns, thermal sunder to buff my weapons with his augment, and redline to give a massive fire rate buff to my weapons. With all of this in mind and my Latum in hand, this fight turned out to be actually pretty easy. Don't get me wrong, it still took around the same time to beat as Yanis 4, but most of that playtime came from the mission before the actual fight. Like I said before, the one is super slow and most of its attacks are honestly really easy to avoid. The biggest difficulty of the fight was honestly waiting for an enemy with a weak point to spawn so I could refill my Latum's Incarnate Charge to blitz through the rest of the fight. After another hour of playtime and only 3 total attempts, I found a good run and killed the fragmented one without that many problems. With another cool new glyph under my belt, I went to go see what the Samdali reward was for this fight since I had never actually seen it before and oh, lovely! For the next boss I attempted, I actually had to craft not 1, but 2 new frames, and for good reason. The Parada Rebellion game mode actually has a secret 4th mission called the Guilty, which is only accessible by visiting the Lotus at the Dark Refractory, switching to play as Uriel, and using the bow or deep bow emote in front of her. I didn't know this was a thing, and so not long before I decided I wanted to do these super bosses, I kinda sorta fed my Uriel to the massive flesh that lives in my walls. Whoopsie. It's honestly fine though, since I still had another frame to craft anyway, that being Noko for my actual run of the Guilty. This goofy fella is honestly kind of a crazy frame, but I initially had zero plans to even use his kit since I was under the assumption that the magnetic effects would be a lot more prevalent. That is, until I saw an absolutely insane run-up from Noob.ia on YouTube that showcased a sub 3 minute mission time using an AoE mushroom nuke with Shade as my sentinel for invisibility. I'll link their video in the description, go check it out, it's genuinely crazy. Since I was kinda hinging on staying invisible to avoid detection anyway, I completely skipped out on survivability for Noko in favor of maxing out my range and my ability strength. I subsumed Roar over his 3rd ability for even more damage, and took Arcane Crepuscular for additional ability strength and crit damage while I was invisible. This was also the only boss where I didn't bring my Latum, instead opting for dual Toxicists, which I thankfully already had built and ready for use. Unlike the other super bosses, the Guilty has no mission requirement beforehand once you've unlocked the game mode, so attempts really started flying. This mode has you face buffed versions of all 3 Parada bosses in a row, giving you 9 minutes to clear them all before the game starts stacking debuffs onto you. The first wave, the Prime Vanguard, is easily the hardest portion in my opinion. Maybe it would be more manageable if I was playing with a build that could withstand more than a light gust of wind, but this section killed far more attempts than either of the other two. Despite being invisible for almost all of my attempts, that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily invulnerable. With each phase, outside of the regular bosses that spawn, the Guilty adds extra frames that spawn during each wave. Every wave gets a Trinity Prime unique to this game mode, which has a stage-wide heal that can be a huge problem if you don't kill her first, and many waves will also spawn an additional, unkillable frame at the top of the stage that acts kinda like a turret, sending out huge AoE attacks that, while usually not super targeted at the player, can be a huge nuisance. If my Shade gets hit even a single time, it's wraps. Unless I also have a Taron Strike available, Shade dying means I can't go invisible, and with no survivability, the run is guaranteed to die here. After a lot of attempts though, I eventually got the Qs for these attacks down, and was able to dodge them pretty well. As for my actual damage, rather than using my Toxicists, I kinda just spam mushrooms into the floor and watch everything die. Before the Vanguard spawns, there's a window where I can place down my 2 for a bit of energy gain, and once I max it out, I just walk past the enemies, mash my 1 into the floor around them, cast Roar, and my 4th ability to constantly activate all of the mushrooms and deal a ton of damage. So long as I don't lose Shade, this section can be cleared really quickly, bringing me to the Dactylists. This phase is honestly kind of a joke. The main pain point is that you have to kill both Dactylists in quick succession or else they revive each other, but when my main source of damage is a stage-wide nuke, they don't really stand much of a chance. From here, it's onto the Hun Hulus, the only phase where I use my gun, and the only phase with any actual execution required with this loadout. During the stage transition, I mashed out Roar so I could get my damage buff in before farming Incarnate Charge of the Hun Hulus' head. From here, I have to pretty much immediately kill one of the Meritics that spawns, giving me a slingshot point, which gives me a massive boost with void damage. From here, I pretty much have to keep myself in the air from the slingshot points, or else I will die almost immediately. The void damage boost is incredibly useful though, and lets me take out the Hun Hulus' Synovia insanely quickly, opening the head to damage. After 3 slingshots, I cleared out the last of his health, and after just a little bit of waiting, I was thrown into Arcwing for the final phase of the fight. This section is much more relaxed than the first, only really needing to mag dump the boss's head while I dodged super telegraphed lasers that come in from around the arena. With the Hun Hulus finally dead after another clean hour of attempts, I had claimed my 3rd set of rewards and was on to the final Superboss currently in the game, the H09 Apex tank. I'm going to be completely upfront here, the tank was by far the most difficult boss for me to complete. Every other boss took around an hour's of attempts each, and the tank took me almost 5 hours across 2 different sessions. There are so many things that can go wrong with this fight, and with a relatively long walk up to the arena and a sometimes pretty annoying puzzle, these attempts often took me a really long time just to get snuffed out before I even had a chance to lock in. For my loadout this run, I swapped over to Mag, my favorite protoframe in the game, and I once again ran my Torrid and Latum, only this time with a little bit of thought into my melee. The tank, unlike most other super bosses, can be armor stripped, and so I chose to bring Bastalok with Shattering Impact so I could click E twice at the start of each phase and make things much easier for myself. Unfortunately, I had forgotten to pick one up during the Tenocon relay, and so I had to drop a fat 50 platinum to pick this one up. Now, the more knowledgeable of you may look at this loadout and think, man, this really is kind of ass, and you would be right. Torrid is fine for minion clear during the second phase of the fight, but there are much better weapons that could be running in all slots. I should have ran Latron as my primary with the Incarnate evolution that allows it to armor strip, and a Lex or a slam melee like the Magistar to nuke waypoints in all phases. But unfortunately for me, I just don't have those built. I honestly debated buying parts for Latron Prime since I already have an adapter in my inventory, but I would have still needed to spend even more to get a Sancta Magistar, and I just didn't want to spend more platinum on this build. Even with my slightly scuffed loadout though, I was determined to make this work. For many of my early attempts, I kinda just wasted Rolling Guard and died super early into the fight, but on the few attempts that made it past the first 10 seconds, I would work on my game plan. Once the tank entered the field, I would tap E a couple of times to armor strip before focusing on weak points with my Latum. Once the tank became vulnerable, it was insanely important for me to kill the marked paratroopers before they touched the ground by dropping them out of the air. The enemies that spawn during this fight, as with every other super boss, have incredibly high resistances to damage and take a really long time to kill. However, if I can insta-kill them with fall damage, I can end this phase in far less time. With the tank stripped of armor, it only takes 2 RPG shots to remove a bar of health, strip it again, clear the weak points, and repeat with a second RPG to finally finish the first phase. After a while, this phase got just a little bit easier for me to handle, though unfortunately I still wasn't quite ready for phase 2. After several failed attempts had made it this far, I decided to change up my mods. For starters, I rebuilt my mag with more of an emphasis on air movement, with aerodynamic and mobilize. Aerodynamic makes me take less damage while airborne, and while the majority of the tank's attacks can be pretty well avoided as long as I stay in the air, it was still pretty useful for whenever I couldn't dodge an attack. I also rebuilt my Latum for gas damage, as the tank uses techrot damage resistances, meaning gas would just outright do more damage than what I was running before. I also swapped my turret from my usual corrosive and blast build to viral and heat, since this combo would be a little bit more useful for debuffing minions so that my Latum could take care of them. Finally, I swapped my Sentinel off of Diriga in favor of Nautilus for the sole fact that Nautilus is just more tanky and would be more consistent for sacrifice. With everything finally in place, and after around 4 hours of failure, I had found my run. At this point, I had really refined my game plan. I'd actually learned you could strip the tank before the fight properly started, as it was still hittable during its drive up to the player. This let me immediately focus on my movement once the tank actually started attacking, and made things so much easier for this first phase. Once the weak points were down, the tank gains a few new moves, most notably this giant spray that covers a third of the arena with nullifying goo that, if I landed on without rolling first, would literally just kill me. I also improved my roll usage a ton, making a point to only roll during AoE attacks that were harder to dodge, or in the event that I had to touch down in the goop for one reason or another. After the first half of the tank's health was gone, I had to armor strip again, which was actually one of the riskiest parts of this phase. It's much faster to fire a light and a heavy attack in quick succession while grounded, though it's definitely risky to do so without proper timing. Either way, I re-stripped the tank without issue, and was able to safely play out the rest of phase 1 before finding out the tank is actually very much alive and full of flesh, and entering the second phase. This second part of the fight is much longer and generally even harder than the first half, for many reasons. First off, the weak points on the tank are a bit less consistent to hit with my Latum, due in part to the tank being a lot more maneuverable as well as the giant limbs that it has blocking my view. Secondly, the tank's healing phases, despite there only being 2, are a huge pain to deal with in this version of the fight. The minions that rush to heal the tank are a lot more durable than usual, and if I can't stack damage off of the miasmites that spawn first, it can be pretty rough trying to kill literally anything before it reaches the tank. The moveset of this phase can also be a huge pain to deal with. This phase is full of incredibly large AoE attacks that hit pretty much the entire arena, as well as several moves with really strong homing that can be difficult to avoid without rolling guard. The Mucus Spires specifically are an incredibly dangerous summon that the tank has, not only denying you chunks of the arena, but also spewing out high damaging homing shots that can end your run in an instant if you don't take them down quickly. However, this half isn't all bad. The miasmites, as annoying as they can be, actually give a really big boost to my turret's damage, and at one point in my fight I dropped my Latum entirely because it just wasn't keeping up against the weak points, not to mention how much harder it is to build Incarnate for my Latum compared to the Torrent at this point. For the first time in literally any of these fights, I could keep Primary Merciless stacked for a huge 360% damage buff, and the Latum just couldn't keep up with that. After several minutes of kiting, I had brought the tank down to just a sliver of health when I made a minor mistake. I had failed to roll out of a slime attack, got staggered, and was down with just a sliver of health left on the tank. Nautilus had just recovered, so I thought maybe I could get a revive from it, but no. Nautilus died before it even hit 20%, and with no Incarnate charge, all I could do was just mag dump with the Latum, hoping it would be enough. And well, I made it. With only 3 seconds of bleed out left, and after nearly 5 hours, I had killed the tank, wrapping up my final Superboss of the set, and claiming the glyph that honestly inspired me to do this in the first place. I love Atlas Goss and Noko, sure, but I've kept the same Stardays Aoi glyph equipped since the day it released, and I wanted a new one. So, how did I do? Over around 8 hours of playtime across 2 days, I beat all 4 super bosses that are currently in the game, claiming 4 of the 24 accolade glyphs in the process, as well as all of the incredibly goofy shipsum dollies. This was really fun to do, and even if you don't care about collecting the rewards, I still think that everyone should give these a try someday. I would love to come back and try to get the rest of the glyphs as well so I can collect the Honoria, but that's gonna have to be a video for another day. If you've made it this far into the video, be sure to subscribe so you can see more of my content in the future. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching.